There is an unspoken truth embedded in our modern existence, one that whispers through empty hallways and resonates in the spaces between our daily interactions. It is the truth that when we remain silent after witnessing the rejection of others, we do not merely ignore their pain. We participate in a slow, relentless process of dehumanization. In these moments of silence, the very essence of what it means to be human is diminished, and lives are, in a very real sense, being killed. Today we will look into the thinking of Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher who redefined ethics as an encounter with the other. His work challenges us to examine the responsibility that lies within each silent moment and to question how our inaction may contribute to the suffering of those already rejected by society. In the mid-20th century, amidst a world scarred by conflict and division, Emmanuel Levinas emerged with a radical rethinking of ethics. For Levinas, ethics is not an abstract system of rules or a branch of theoretical philosophy. It is the very foundation of human existence. At the core of his thought is the encounter with the other, a face-to-face meeting that transcends mere communication and imposes an immediate, unyielding responsibility. Levinas writes that the face of the other is not simply a physical presence, but a manifestation of vulnerability, an appeal for recognition. When we see another person, we are confronted with their fragility and their need. In that moment, a moral command is silently issued: "Thou shalt not kill." But this imperative extends far beyond the literal act of murder. It is a call to protect the other from the myriad forms of harm that our silence can inflict. This philosophy of the other is not a new idea. It echoes through the ancient teachings of dialogue and mutual recognition. Yet Levinas brings it into a stark, modern light. He argues that every time we choose to remain silent when someone is rejected, we fail in our fundamental duty. Our silence becomes an instrument of violence, a refusal to acknowledge the inherent worth of the other. For Levinas, ethics begins with this asymmetrical relationship. Unlike reciprocal relationships where rights and obligations are evenly balanced, the encounter with the other is uneven. The other, in their vulnerability, places an infinite demand upon us. Our response is not a choice, but an obligation, a responsibility that demands that we speak, act, and bear witness. And when we fail to do so, when our silence becomes a barrier to recognition and care, we contribute to a moral decay that is as pervasive as it is pernicious. To understand the destructive power of silence, we must first grasp its nature. Silence is often seen as a neutral state, a lack of noise or a pause in conversation. Yet, in Levinas's view, silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of neglect. It is a choice, a decision to withhold empathy and to refuse the call of the other. In a society where voices are celebrated and opinions are voiced, the decision to remain mute in the face of injustice carries with it an ethical weight. Imagine a moment when a person, marginalized and rejected, reaches out for help. Their face, raw with the evidence of suffering, urges us to respond. According to Levinas, that face speaks a language beyond words. It communicates a need so fundamental that to ignore it is to commit an act of violence. This violence is not always visible. It does not always announce itself with dramatic flair. Often, it is the quiet, unremarked choice to look away, to allow isolation and despair to deepen. Silence, then, becomes a form of complicity. It is an active decision to allow the other to languish without the light of acknowledgement. In a sense, our quiet acquiescence is a slow murder, a gradual erosion of hope and dignity that leaves the rejected utterly defenseless. Levinas challenges us to see this connection between silence and violence. He reminds us that ethics is not an abstract ideal, but a lived reality, one in which every moment of inaction contributes to a cycle of suffering and dehumanization. Central to Levinas's philosophy is the idea that ethics begins with responsibility, a responsibility that arises from the encounter with the other. This responsibility is infinite. It cannot be measured, negotiated, or diminished. When we stand before the other, we are called to respond. This response, Levinas suggests, is not one of obligation in the legal or conventional sense, but an ethical imperative that transcends rules and conventions. Levinas's concept of infinity is crucial here. He argues that the other represents an infinite, uncontainable value, a presence that cannot be fully grasped or reduced to familiar categories. In encountering this infinite other, our own finite existence is challenged. We are called to transcend our self-interest and engage in an act of radical hospitality, a willingness to risk ourselves for the sake of another. In this light, silence is not a passive act. It is an active refusal to assume the infinite responsibility that is inherent in being human. When we choose silence, we deny the other the recognition they so desperately need. We are, in effect, saying that their suffering is not our concern, that their pain is too distant from our own experience. Levinas warns that this denial is not a minor failing. It is an ethical crisis. Each silent moment chips away at the bonds of communal life, paving the way for isolation, despair, and ultimately, the destruction of our shared humanity. In our modern world, where individualism and self-interest often prevail, Levinas's call to responsibility is more urgent than ever. Our social institutions, our digital networks, and even our everyday interactions are frequently marked by a disconcerting indifference, a collective silence that reinforces the rejection of those who are deemed different, unwanted, or unworthy. To counter this, Levinas challenges us to break the silence, to affirm that every life matters and that each encounter with the other is an opportunity to affirm the sacredness of existence. In the age of digital communication and hyperconnectivity, the paradox of silence has taken on a new dimension. Our screens are awash with information, yet the spaces between messages, the quiet corners of our online communities, are often where the most profound forms of rejection occur. Social media, while heralded as a tool for connection, can also amplify the sense of isolation. A single tweet, a post left unanswered, can speak volumes about the indifference of a society that has grown accustomed to casting aside those who do not conform. Consider the experience of being digitally ostracized, a phenomenon all too common in today's world. When a person's opinions are rejected, their contributions dismissed without a word, the impact is not merely a fleeting moment of hurt. It is a cumulative process of erasure, where each instance of silence further isolates the individual from the community. Levinas would argue that in these moments, the ethical imperative to respond is more critical than ever. Our silence in this context is not benign. It is an active participation in the marginalization and dehumanization of others. Modern society often prizes efficiency and convenience over genuine connection. In our rush to process information and move on to the next headline, we neglect the deeper, quieter calls for help. The rejection that occurs in digital spaces may seem abstract, but its effects are deeply real. It corrodes trust, fosters alienation, and reinforces the barriers that keep us from truly understanding one another. Levinas's philosophy reminds us that every ignored cry, every unacknowledged plea contributes to a culture of indifference, a culture where silence becomes a weapon that kills not just individual spirit, but the very fabric of our collective humanity. In workplaces, in schools, and even in our families, the pattern is all too familiar. Rejection often comes in subtle forms: a dismissal of ideas, an unreturned message, a silence that speaks louder than words. And with each instance, we are faced with a choice: to break the silence, to engage in compassionate dialogue, or to allow the cycle of isolation to continue unchecked. Levinas calls on us to recognize that our ethical responsibility is not limited by time or circumstance. It is a constant demand that rises with each encounter with the other. Levinas's work is, at its heart, a call to ethical awakening. It is an invitation to re-examine the way we relate to one another, to see every moment of interaction as an opportunity to affirm life, to reject indifference, and to embrace the infinite responsibility that defines our shared humanity. In his vision, every face we encounter is a mirror reflecting our own vulnerability and the promise of connection. To ignore this reflection is to turn away from our duty, to let the very soul of society wither in the darkness of silence. The ethical awakening that Levinas envisions is not achieved through grand gestures alone. It is cultivated in the small, everyday acts of recognition and care. It is found in the decision to listen intently to a colleague who feels undervalued, to reach out to a neighbor who appears isolated, or to engage in a conversation with someone whose voice has been silenced by rejection. Each of these acts, however modest they may seem, is an affirmation of the truth that every life carries an infinite worth. In our personal lives, we are confronted with countless moments when the easy path is one of silence, when acknowledging the pain of another would demand us to disrupt the comfortable status quo. Yet Levinas challenges us to see these moments as moral crossroads. The decision to speak out, to bridge the gap of isolation with empathy and understanding, is not just a personal triumph. It is an act of resistance against the forces of dehumanization that pervade our culture. The transformative potential of Levinas's philosophy lies in the practice of ethical dialogue, a dialogue that transcends the limitations of language and reaches into the very core of human connection. Unlike debates aimed at winning an argument or establishing dominance, ethical dialogue is rooted in a genuine encounter with the other. It is a conversation in which the primary objective is not to be heard, but to listen, not to judge, but to understand. This approach to dialogue challenges the notion that every silence is neutral. Instead, it posits that every moment of silence is laden with ethical possibility. In choosing to respond to the other, we open a channel through which compassion can flow, a channel that transforms rejection into recognition and isolation into inclusion. It is in this space, where words are not weapons but bridges, that the true healing of society begins. The practice of ethical dialogue is both a personal discipline and a social revolution. It calls upon us to confront the discomfort of uncertainty, to embrace the vulnerability inherent in every human encounter. By doing so, we honor the infinite value of the other, and in that honor, we reclaim the moral ground that has been eroded by our collective silence. Levinas reminds us that ethical dialogue is not an abstract ideal reserved for philosophers. It is a lived reality, a continuous act of courage that each of us must undertake. What then is the cost of our ignorance? Each time we allow rejection to pass without challenge, we contribute to a culture in which the weak are left to suffer, their voices lost in the din of indifference. Our silence creates a vacuum where empathy should reside, a vacuum that, over time, expands to consume the very spaces in which community and connection might otherwise flourish. Consider the cumulative effect of ignored pleas, the toll of every unspoken word. In families, in schools, in neighborhoods, the quiet acceptance of rejection leads to an erosion of trust. The structures that bind us begin to crumble, and the promise of a shared future fades into a desolate present. Levinas's ethical imperative, then, becomes a beacon, an urgent summons to reclaim the moral territory that our silence has forfeited. Yet, there is hope. The power to transform our society lies in our willingness to respond, to break the silence that suffocates potential, and to affirm the worth of every individual. It is in the deliberate, often quiet acts of engagement that we counter the violence of indifference. Each time we choose to speak up for those rejected, we restore a measure of dignity and rekindle the spark of connection. In doing so, we not only honor the teachings of Levinas, but also contribute to a legacy of ethical renewal that can shape a more compassionate future. In our modern age, the implications of Levinas's philosophy are as urgent as ever. The digital realm, a space that promises instantaneous connection and endless interaction, has paradoxically given rise to new forms of silence. Online, rejection is often swift, and the echo of indifference is amplified by algorithms that reward conformity over genuine dialogue. Every ignored comment, every unacknowledged message becomes part of a vast tapestry of digital isolation. In these virtual spaces, the rejection of an individual's voice is not an isolated incident. It is a systemic phenomenon, one that reinforces the marginalization of those who dare to be different. Levinas's call to ethical responsibility challenges us to reconsider our online behavior. It asks us to look beyond the anonymity of the screen and recognize the infinite other behind every profile, every post, every silent plea. By engaging in mindful, compassionate communication online, we can begin to dismantle the structures that perpetuate digital isolation. We must challenge the notion that silence is harmless. Instead, we must see it for what it truly is: a rejection of the other's humanity, a failure to acknowledge the moral imperative that binds us together. In doing so, we lay the groundwork for a digital culture that values genuine connection over superficial engagement. In embracing this ethical responsibility, the belief that our capacity is able to heal, to transform, and to connect lies not in grand gestures alone, but in the quiet, persistent act of breaking our silence. Every time we choose to listen, to speak, and to stand in solidarity with those rejected, we contribute to a ripple of change that can transcend the boundaries of our own lives. Your silence after their rejection is not an accident. It is a choice, and it is a choice with consequences that echo far beyond the confines of a single life. Thank you for watching. May these words inspire you to act, to speak, and to transform your silence into a resounding affirmation of our shared humanity.